Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the labeling of the AfD, Germany's right-wing party, as an extremist organization. We'll also discuss Trump's plan to reopen Alcatraz and to protect homegrown American film with tariffs on foreign film production. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So, as we record, it's being reported that Friedrich Merz, the head of the Christian Democratic Union, Germany's leading center-right party, long part of the governing coalition, has failed to be elected the Chancellor of Germany, an unprecedented situation in post-war Germany for a man in his position as the leading party, as head of the leading party, not to be elected chancellor. They're going to have to hold another vote. It's a sign of dissatisfaction, seemingly within his own coalition and his own party. And in the background, there's the really remarkable step of German domestic intelligence labeling the AfD a kind of right populist, often described as far-right party, being labeled extremist. Now, the AfD was founded during the an earlier stage of European dissension over the monetary union as a kind of free market party. Those were its origins. But in response to the wave of migration that came into Europe and Germany in 2015, it really repositioned itself as the party that was most consistently and absolutely opposed to migration. And it's this opposition that has led it into trouble, as it's been charged with having an ethnic conception of identity that's at odds with kind of human dignity and democratic respect on which Germany is based. So, in defense of democracy, a party has been labeled an extremist organization. Ashley, what do you make of the battle over AfD's status and the general travails of the German governing class?
Yeah, in defense of democracy, we must shut down democratic debate and political parties using courts, using clandestine MI5 type groups and labels. Sure, that sounds totally fine. And this is the thing. This is the thing that Germany has had to walk this line for a long time. They don't want to repeat the past, obviously, but the options available to them are sort of ban political parties, which ironically is kind of what they're ostensibly trying to prevent, which is the rise of a party that will ban political parties. So it's quite difficult for Germany. One has to have a little bit of one has to feel bad for them to a certain extent. But obviously, what's been going on here and what's been going on across Europe and Eastern Europe in particular is obviously the rising threat of populism. And, a few years ago, there were sort of mumblings and half joking references to banning these groups, these leaders. And now they're really doing it. Now they're really sort of using the law, using different little mechanisms to try to push them out of political life. And it's really telling that they're afraid. People would laugh at populism at first, and then they attack it. And now they incorporate its talking points, which is really, really interesting. So one of the things that Merz has had to do is, and what most of the mainstream political parties have had to do, is get serious about immigration, and that is because of the push of the right. However, in Germany, it's a bit like, okay, we're gonna crack down on what's the word that they use, like non-traditional, or I can't remember the word that they were using, but like we'll crack down on this kind of migration, but we will also bring in this kind of migration to have a strong Germany, So they're still they've been using, underlying a lot of this anti-immigrant sentiment is not like pure bigotry, which is what they've been trying to, that was the initial stage of first you laugh at them. It's like, oh, these people are just bigots. We don't need to talk about it. Even across the pond and, well, for you across the border in Canada, Trudeau was trying to say up until relatively recently, like, oh, if anybody brought up immigration, oh, you're just a bigot and we don't have to talk about it. They were so successful in keeping it outside of public debate. And then it just sort of came back to bite them, where people were annoyed because they were using immigration, as I've said many times before, they were using immigration as a way to kind of prop up GDP, as a way to push economic growth by having migrants come in and do jobs that the locals won't do at the going rate, to bring down. And to push people into these kind of service sector jobs and to push this like servicization of the economy. And people really, really resented that. And they resented the upheaval that came with it, and the changes to their communities, which, someone like Ken and Malik would say would have happened anyway with globalization and neoliberalization. But nonetheless, immigration became a symbol for all these kinds of changes that people didn't want. And so those in power were tried very, very hard to keep all of that out of public debate. And one of the big successes has been the fact that now that it's successes for these groups and their agendas is that now that they've kind of forced politicians kicking and screaming to at least give lip service to immigration. But on the other hand, they have been fighting back, and they've been trying everything that they can to keep these groups out of power. And I have to say I was actually quite surprised that they would do that, because it was, as I said, it was kind of like a joke. Oh, we should ban these parties. Oh, if only we could ban these parties. And now it's actually happening, and it's happening on weird kinds of grounds. Like these, as I mentioned at the start, these kinds of technicalities. But the justification for the AFD as extremist is fairly odd. The key argument is that the AFD promotes the idea that an individual's possible affiliation with Germany goes beyond mere holders to citizenship and assumes that there's an ethno-cultural German identity as well. This implies that naturalized persons are second-class citizens. That's their argument. But that reasoning seems to violate their own constitution, which itself defines German citizens as persons who possess German citizenship or as persons of German ethnic origin living within the boundaries of 1937. So their own constitution includes ethnicity. And something that I've been trying to think about and kind of get my head around is that I think this constant kind of painting like ethno-nationalism and like these people are ethno-nationalists has kind of actually pushed people to take up race, because it was so taboo for such a long time. I'm seeing the return of like biological racism. This has really worried me. I think I sort of cut my teeth. No, I think I did. I cut my teeth on social construction of race and all of this kind of stuff. And I'm seeing that return. And I think it's because, once you push people out of polite society, well, they're already outside of polite society. So part of what gets them pushed out was saying the unsayable. Was, well, then I will say maybe there is something about race. Maybe there is something here to talk about. When actually ethnicity, ethnos, means culture. And you can have ethno-nationalism, which means the culture of a nation. And I remember at the NatCon conference last year, there was this whole thing where Antifa was trying to shut it down, and I was there, and the police came in, and all the cameras, all the media just like whipped around and right up in the face of these police officers, and they looked really, really stunned. And it was just really amazing because the charge was that this was like an ethno-nationalist rally, but the hero of the day was an immigrant to Belgium who, after tons of different venues had been, threatened by Antifa, stepped in and said, I will do this. And Nigel Farage was like championing this guy. Why? Because he was showing himself to be part of the ethnos of the society, and actually part of the sort of, profiteering kind of, or like the not profiteering, but the sort of like profit chasing bourgeoisification of that kind of makes us all the same, that allows us to kind of connect with each other in that kind of capitalist culture. So I think we've kind of turned ethnos into something really horrible in this terrible kind of subject, but there is a kind of culture to a nation that most people, when it comes to non-Western societies, are willing to say, oh, this is a really good thing. I'm indigenous, I'm native Canadian. People are always talking about how great my culture is. So it was not very long before somebody else says, well, what about my culture? What about my history? Why am I supposed to be ashamed of it? Right. And that doesn't have to be an exclusive thing, that you can come. And in fact, like my grandfather, I always think, was more native than a lot of the people in my family, even though he was Irish. He was an orphan that my grandmother's parents took in. And he was like always dressed up and everything. He was at the powwows. He would go disappear into the woods for weeks at a time. That's ethnos, and that used to be inclusive. Ironically, I think people on the left made ethnos into something very exclusive through things like cultural appropriation and so on. So I'm sorry, I've gone on several kind of tangents there, but I think just to sort of summarize, I think it doesn't even make sense on its own terms why they have banned the AFD. I think it's really concerning that they're getting quite desperate and moving to kind of inching toward, did I say ban? I meant to say a label as extremist, that they're moving toward banning the AFD and banning these populist parties. And I think that we are, by sort of painting everything that has ethnos in it as not as sort of racist, not only is it incoherent, it becomes ironically more and more exclusive, and it actually affirms that exclusivity of ethnicity that didn't really need to be there. It can be quite an inclusive liberal kind of idea that you can include people in different cultures, and that there's no necessary connection between one's culture and one's race. But that's kind of being obliterated, but it's being obliterated across the political spectrum.
I want to make a couple quick points uh, in response to your excellent comments, Ashley. One, ethno-nationalism is close to a pleonasm because the idea of nationality itself, is kind of based on the idea of being etymologically it's connected to birth, right? So there's a certain notion of descent. So if ethno-nationalism is meant to indicate a form of nationalism that's particularly based on descent, it's almost redundant in that sense. But in most traditional societies, there is a notion of adoption. You can be adopted into a family, right? And also there are ideas of legitimacy and illegitimacy. So an adopted child might have more legitimacy than a child who uh, might have legitimacy that a child actually sired by the head of a family lacks because he's not born, under the right legal circumstances. So, there's I think it's worth keeping in mind when you think about nationality that, like any other community, it's something that it should be possible to join through legal means, and that's far from that being a rejection of older or more traditional models of what society or community is. You know that's an ancient legal concept, and I just thought of that when hearing your great comments about your was it father or grandfather
My
who was the
grandfather, yeah.
yeah,
I said
yeah,
he's
your
an orphan, but he was
the
orphaned a little
Irish,
bit late in life. Like, it's not
right,
like my grandmother married her adopted brother or something.
the Irish kid who was indigenous, right? I mean that goes to show the reality of these ideas.
So yeah, it's interesting what Ashley brings up. I'm not an expert in German immigration law or the German Constitution, but I did.
But you're a journalist, so you can declaim
I
on
can exactly.
all and sundry.
But I did study in Germany during college briefly, um, it- learning the language and spending the semester there, and I hung out with some very kind of lefty academics and students during that time, and this was relatively I guess it was early 2000s, so within roughly a decade of the reunification of East and West Germany, and they talked about various things that are relevant to this discussion and the point that Ashley brought up. I mean, one was this idea of Blutrecht, like that basically people were entitled to citizenship through being able to trace German ancestry. And at that time, what I remember was you saw a lot of kind of, and this is so interesting on so many levels, and I hadn't thought about it for a while, but there were these kind of young, disaffected youth who you'd see kind of hanging out in the central square of the small city where I was studying. And at some point, somebody explained to me that these were mostly recent teenagers from families that had recently migrated from Russia and Eastern Europe, and had been able to migrate because of being able to point to having a German grandparent from back when the German nationality was scattered throughout much of what's now Russia, Poland, and the rest of Eastern Europe. And many of those people were ethnically cleansed and sort of sent into what became Germany during around the end of the Second World War. But some families remained, or some individuals remained, and then particularly as a result of the kind of opening up, the end of the Iron Curtain, there was a wave of migration of people who could, through the German definition of citizenship, were able to claim citizenship on the basis of having one German grandparent, basically, right? And this is something that many European countries have a version of this kind of right to citizenship. And what some people pointed out to me at the time, again, these kind of lefty, activists and academic types, was that, meanwhile, you had this whole generation of younger people of Turkish descent whose parents had been Gastarbeiter, right, had been brought in through this guest worker program in the 60s and 70s, which created this large kind of Turkish, ethnic Turkish presence in Germany. And there were many who had been born in Germany who were actually unable to gain German citizenship, or had a much harder time gaining German citizenship. So they were, essentially had grown up entirely in Germany. Many of them didn't even speak Turkish and had very weak connections to Turkey, but were still unable to be, or had trouble becoming German citizens. Meanwhile, there were these Russian-speaking youth who had citizenship but were quite sort of alienated and disconnected from the culture. And so, anyway, it was an interesting thing where the kind of contradictions of this model were being discussed, and this was before, obviously, the huge wave of migration that occurred in the 2010s and was kind of explicitly embraced by the center-right government under Angela Merkel, who, as I understand it, it was partly explicitly a kind of labor, as was the guest worker project in the 60s and 70s of bringing in a huge number of Turkish workers. It was a way of kind of expanding the pool of labor, and in part sort of weakening the hand of the unions and of labor in terms of their negotiating power with capital, and similarly the massive expansion of the labor pool through this huge importing of migrants in the 2010s by a center-right government was not unrelated to various other things, like the ways that both Schroeder, the center-left sort of Blairite government in Germany, and then Merkel had been in various ways trying to kind of weaken the hand of labor in a country where historically it's remained relatively strong. And so the final thing that's interesting here again is that and here I think we can connect it to Romania, where as we've covered, the sort of right populist candidate was the winner of an election that was then sort of overturned on the basis of these sort of spurious allegations of Russian interference. And now the election is on, they're sort of redoing it and hoping for a better result as far as the NATO and EU establishment are concerned. And so, what all of this has to do is this attempt to pursue this European project through expansion and integration. And, that's relevant to the AFD here because the heartland of the AFD is the former East Germany, right? Is what was a very much kind of outside of the European Union and sort of the West until several decades ago. And this idea that you could just kind of seamlessly expand the EU, the Schengen zone of free movement, and also kind of open it up, at least selectively, to other parts of the world, and you just have this kind of interchangeable model of the human subject who can just be kind of brought in or allowed to move freely in this whole region. And this whole model seems to be coming up against its limits, and the sort of attempt to expand it through this expansion to the east is clearly the kind of major flashpoint. Although obviously with the rise of and the attempts to kind of use lawfare to suppress Marine Le Pen in France, it's not exclusively in these kind of former eastern border zones, but nonetheless, the major flashpoints of it seem to often be these areas where there was really this extreme confidence that you could just kind of keep expanding this model of Europe and this kind of new model of citizenship, which, as we were just saying, is oddly in tension with the models of citizenship that are still written into the constitutions of these countries themselves, where everybody is just kind of interchangeable and mobile and fluid. That clearly this model is kind of chafing against its limits, and now is having to turn to a much more kind of aggressively authoritarian approach in order to maintain itself, which then weirdly kind of contradicts this idea that it's about the expansion of freedom. And so, yeah, it's a very fascinating moment, and I don't, I genuinely don't. I think that the most likely way this will be resolved is basically through a kind of, we talked about the Canada election last week, I believe, but through a kind of soft co-optation of some of these themes and ideas, where the establishment will kind of ultimately having, kind of fended off through illiberal means these threats to it, it will in some way kind of co-opt some of the themes so as to kind of re-legitimize itself for the moment. And that's, probably the most, and you saw this with Merz, who's now struggling to assemble a coalition, right? That he already kind of took a tougher turn on migration last year in the lead up to this election. And so that's likely to happen. So, the question is whether that's enough to resolve these quite fundamental contradictions of the whole project.
As we record, Merz has managed to get the needed votes. By hook or by crook, he has done it. Part of Merz's agenda going forward is to increase defense spending. Germany and other European countries are going to set aside the fiscal limits they've long faced and that have long been used to justify various forms of austerity to build up a stronger military. So that's another very important kind of transformation we're seeing right now in the context, of course, of the Russia-Ukraine war. And exactly how that conflict plays into all this is, an interesting and important question. Of course, AfD's voter base is primarily in the former East Germany, and the AfD has taken a more dovish line on Ukraine. So it'll be interesting to see how that conflict plays into all this. If there are charges, the ubiquitous charges of Russian collusion that come into play. Here in the United States, Trump's campaign of constant proposals and new initiatives continues. And two of the most attention getting this week were Trump's idea to reopen Alcatraz, site of course, the film The Rock, and my own favorite of these movies, Don Siegel's film Escape from Alcatraz, starring Clint Eastwood. I guess I'm pro reopening Alcatraz. It seems really impractical to me. It seems costly. It seems unnecessary. We have a supermax prison in Colorado that contains a lot of the worst already. But I guess I see this as Trump trying to revive the geography of American law and order and of crime and justice. And this is one of the great names. So I view this as an attempt to kind of revive and preserve a sort of mythic geography of America. So I guess I favor it in that sense, even though I can produce absolutely no practical argument for it.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to see, like anything, what's the game here? And Trump is such a fantastic political figure, and I don't mean that in the sense of like I personally feel that he's wonderful. I mean, what an incredible anomaly. And how it works in this really strange way because you know 50 to 90% of what he says seems utterly insane, and you can never tell if he is being serious. And if you think about it from the 4D chess of like nuclear war, I mean, that's a really brilliant position to put yourself in because that's exactly what you want. You want a madman who's hovering over the button. He can never say, no, I'll never launch nuclear weapons. I might do. So, hover over the button. I might just open Alcatraz again. That's just something I would do. And and him being maybe a genius, maybe a total idiot, is the most incredible bit of political maneuvering I have ever seen because if it was any other politician, you might be sitting there going, okay, like what's the big game here? But it is always possible that there is no game, and that you're just wasting your time and that it'll just be forgotten by tomorrow. So it's I find it so difficult to comment on Trump in the public sphere because, how many times do I go on the radio or whatever? Trump is in the news because he needs his name in everybody's mouth at all times. That's also a key kind of driver behind some of this. And you want to go into some like deep interpretation of what might be going on here, but it might be forgotten by Tuesday. It's really incredible. But yeah, I do think this is a bit of political performance. So now that I say it's impossible to interpret it, I will now make an attempt to do so. It seems to me like a bit of a clear bit of political theater that signals toughness, but yes, as you say, a return to kind of mythic American geography, a time when America was tough on crime and so on, and didn't have them in these California prisons on prime real estate land and where they teach them woodworking and tell them to get in touch with their feelings, and who knows, maybe he wants to sell some of that prime California real estate that the prisons are currently sitting on, turn them into condos. I mean, Alcatraz was turned into a tourist attraction, wasn't it? So it's not,
Yeah.
could easily go the other way. So I don't know. It seems kind of symbolic. On the other hand, perhaps there is a game to play here. Maybe it has something to do with real estate, but it's like the Hollywood tariffs that were also announced at the same time. It all seems like perhaps this was something that someone told Trump just before he went out the door this morning. He half remembered it. Oh yeah, and we'll have 100% tariffs on Hollywood, and we'll reopen Alcatraz. There.
Yeah, so I do want to get to the Hollywood tariffs in a moment here, and just in terms of the prison reopening. I think too of there's a kind of picturesqueness to Alcatraz that probably Trump is reaching for. That's why it's a Hollywood site. And I think that's one thing you can say about our prisons, whether they are meant to be forbidding or attractive in some way. They are less picturesque than they once were. They're less integrated into um, the visual landscape. And what I mean by this is just if you think of kind of the federal supermax prison in Colorado, try to call an image to mind of that, and you can't. For Alcatraz, certainly you can. You might think of Eastern State Penitentiary, a very early American prison in Philadelphia, which Tocqueville visited, and it's this Gothic kind of castle construction embedded right there in the city. And so it's kind of impressive and forbidding, but it's integrated right into the urban fabric. And so there's this kind of acknowledgement of these social functions being carried out, which seems to have kind of disappeared in time, where we've kind of pushed it out of sight and even we've made it almost less visible by conducting it in buildings that are less iconic and recognizable. In State College, Pennsylvania, the center of Pennsylvania, there's Rockview prison, and that's on very well manicured grounds. It has this kind of classical facade up on a hill overlooking a highway and a railroad tracks with a symmetrical row of trees in front. And there's the attached prison farm, and it's strangely the most kind of lovely and peaceful thing in the immediate area. It's very odd. And this is the place where executions are carried out. In the state of Pennsylvania, of course, the farm is run by the inmates. And this is a quite old institution. It was built in the early 1900s and is still in operation. So there's been this kind of change in the way we conceive of prisons, and I do think there was there's something in the kind of imposing and sometimes strangely even kind of picturesque or minimally dignified appearance of prisons that really kind of spoke to a society that was just more comfortable acknowledging the functions that any society will carry out.
You raise such an interesting point, because it really, there are parallels with the Victorian asylums, the era of the insane asylum, right, which we kind of remember as the bad old days, but in many ways was the golden age of like in some areas could have been and was, in a way, the golden age of actually kind of creating communities for patients and caring for patients, whereas the era of deinstitutionalization outsourced all of that to the community, which and it was supposed to be like community care and integration, but of course it was just isolation, and people were just left to rot. And in a lot of ways, that the era of the big institution, the asylum and the prison, were symbolic of a state that actually did things, as opposed to a hollowed out state now. And ironically, the whole abolish the prison movement is a continuation of that kind of deinstitutionalization and neoliberalization. Whereas, in a way, Trump seems to be harking back and moving back, and has in his mind this memory of a time when the state actually did something useful, which is quite ironic given everything else he said about the state.
Yeah, and which also, when you look at people commenting on this, sort of point out, well, the reason they shut down Alcatraz is it was incredibly expensive to maintain, and sort of it just like not efficient, right? It was terribly inefficient way of doing things, which I suppose is ironic in relation to the Department of Government Efficiency and this kind of broader project. And
I think Nancy Pelosi cited these totally legitimate concerns. By the way,
right.
I think she's right on that.
So I think this does point to a tension within the project, right? Which is sort of, I don't know. It's like we do this not because it's easy, but because it's hard or something. And it's like, well, we want to carry out this improbable feat of resurrecting this prison for the purpose of making a kind of symbolic statement, a powerful symbolic statement. And I think that's I don't know. I mean, I almost want to think back to the opening of Foucault's Discipline and Punish, which would maybe kind of push against Ashley's interpretation of this slightly, because for Foucault, the point is sort of that, the sovereign, the early modern sovereign is the figure who kind of, directly and centrally kind of, decides on the life and death of his subjects, and uniquely has this power. And so, I think there is a part of Trump that's about a kind of reassertion of the prerogatives of traditional sovereignty. And so the centrality of Alcatraz, both symbolically and physically, right? That, if you go to the San Francisco Bay, it's in the middle of the bay, so it's kind of in the, it's surrounded by this whole kind of microcosm of American civilization that is the Bay Area, sort of major metropolitan area. And so it has that kind of central position where it is visible, right? Unlike this Colorado Supermax, which is, I believe, called Florence, USP Florence, where various bad guy, sort of Timothy McVeigh and, the original World Trade Center bombers and people like that were sent. And I believe Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and others. So, that the part of the significance of that is, like, you can't visualize it because it's out in the absolute middle of nowhere in the mountains, which for the efficiency of actually keeping these guys locked up is apparently more effective. There's been no successful escape from there, or even a serious attempt. But it doesn't, it's again, through discipline and punish, it's like the functioning of justice is kind of taken out of its symbolic centrality and made into this, purely kind of technocratic operation, which is largely invisible, and thereby is kind of deprived of its symbolic status in the sort of public imagination.
Right. Yeah,
and nobody's made a movie about, USP Florence. We have many great movies about Alcatraz.
Right, and I actually, as we were doing this podcast, I Googled, the Colorado Supermax prison just to see what the images of it are, and there are just aerial shots of this, kind of sprawling compound on this barren terrain, and there's no distinct or distinguished building. So it's just something that's, I think, it's visible to the eye, but it is kind of invisible to memory or recollection because there's no image of it. It's so indistinct, you almost can't see it. Trump is doing other things. His big initiative is to place tariffs. He said, I don't think we know the details, but he says, we need to tariff foreign film production. Are we going to make Hollywood great again? Are we kind of... I guess I remember when I was younger that the GOP would inveigh against Hollywood liberalism and decadence, but looks like now the GOP is here to save Hollywood. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's very odd. I mean, it depends kind of what you mean by Hollywood. It's unclear what he's talking about. When I first saw it, I thought he seemed to be saying he was going to place tariffs on foreign films, which I suppose would go along with his
145% tariff on I Am Curious Yellow.
so that he would, that it would go along with his outraged tweets about Paris, the Korean film Parasite winning the Best Picture at the Oscars in, I believe it was 2020 or 2021. In any case, but then other people seem to be explaining, no, what he's talking about is Hollywood outsourcing much of its production to other countries. So what he'd be targeting, I mean, the issue with tariffing the actual foreign films that seems bizarre is, like, Hollywood is clearly crushing every other film producer in terms of sheer revenue. It's not as if the latest sort of French art film is eating into Hollywood's box office returns, but so it seems like what he's talking about is tariffing films that are, where the film is supposed to be set in New York, but it's actually filmed in Toronto. Or I believe there are films set in California where it's being filmed in Australia.
I do
Stuff
find
like
the
this.
Toronto, New York films a little strange and unsettling. I sometimes see that and I think, what is this city? And they don't really tell you, but they're trying to convey that kind of classic New York vibe. And you think, well, but where is this actually occurring?
Yeah, and this is a longstanding thing that there are these other places that will compete with Hollywood to provide cheaper on location filming, and so it seems like, again, the tweet itself was somewhat mysterious in terms of what exactly he was going to target, but I think it's interesting. Like it perhaps goes along with something, we've published a few things related to this, that I think part of the weakness of his or the imprecision of his rhetoric is that, it seems that who he claims he wants to punish are these foreign countries that are luring U.S. Film production there with various kinds of tax breaks and discounts and so on, which is true. I mean, it is a thing that happens. But the people who are benefiting from this are themselves the Hollywood, producers and studios. Like, they are the ones who are able to make films and make a greater profit on their films. So, like, the profits from these films are not going by and large to the foreign countries; they're going to the Hollywood studios themselves. So I think that's it's somewhat mysterious. I mean, the other thing that people have brought up here is that they're depending on what if he were to depending on what authority he would use if he does actually go through with this. I guess film production is explicitly excluded from at least one of the acts that he's appealed to announce tariffs previously. So that would be a problem. But I guess there's another one he might use. But I guess the point is that this is people have pointed out that Trump's sort of tariff model and his idea that the U.S. is being screwed or whatever, derives from his focusing entirely on the trade of goods while excluding the trade of services, right? So if you look at the U.S., it actually has a trade surplus with the rest of the world when it comes to services, and films are a good example of this, right? That regardless of whether these films are filmed in Australia or wherever, the reality is that Hollywood is incredibly dominant across the world, as anybody who's traveled will know. And so if you were to actually impose these tariffs, it seems that it wouldn't be particularly good for Hollywood in terms of its. I mean, if there were counter tariffs targeting the export of Hollywood films, which, again, there is already a massive surplus benefiting the U.S. So I don't know. It's very odd.
So the seeming plan to save Hollywood now emerges as
a plan to actually sabotage it.
Yeah, the first effective GOP attack on Hollywood.
Right, which I was thinking about.
It comes full circle.
I tweeted yesterday and said, I'm not sure, given that Hollywood output is largely, increasingly just sort of slop. I'm not sure that this would be bad in terms of global culture. If these tariffs sort of inadvertently dealt a massive blow to Hollywood's output and its kind of global dominance, who knows? That could bring about an accidental golden age, although more or less in the opposite way that is being proposed here, and that it would potentially allow foreign film production to compete more effectively with the U.S. So. So maybe there would be a silver lining there.
Okay, but what about this? When are we getting tariffs on foreign-produced journalism to protect honest American tech producers like all of us here at Compact? Though maybe not Ashley. Maybe not Ashley.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, it's the same kind of issue, right? Like, how much films are global things. They're produced, globally with teams in the UK, and if it's filming on a location in Italy and this and that, you'd have to break down exactly what aspect of the final product is produced outside of the US, and what does 100% tariff mean, like on 100% on what, like 10% of the film. So yeah, like even a magazine like Compact, I'm afraid, has a percentage input from foreign talent.
Yep, those foreign inputs get you every time. Oh well. Yeah, so anybody else, other famous prison escape movies kind of tie together these topics? I put down my flag with Escape from Alcatraz. I think, just a great kind of simple American genre film, basically. Other great prison movies.
Shawshank Redemption.
Sure.
I
haven't seen that in like quite a while.
No, I'm so uncultured. It's horrible. Like I've seen like the big films that you expect, but then I went and had kids. So all I've watched for the last 10 years is like Paw Patrol. I was actually thinking to myself, I was like, did Paw Patrol ever do a prison escape?
Sure, somebody's done the kind of Paw Patrol as neoliberal fantasy take, right? I mean, that's been done.
Well, here's the thing. I watch these films with my kids, right? Movies with my kids, and I'm like sitting there going, that's rather interesting the way that
Well, when I first became aware of Paw Patrol some years ago, my friend, I was like visiting friends whose kids had just gotten into it, and my friend, British friend, dryly remarked, yes, it seems to be about a police state run by puppies.
Yeah, it is. There's a mayor Humdinger, and he's kind of, I don't know, he has a top hat and a monocle or something, but he's this totally bogus and illegitimate figure. And the good guys seem to be this kind of private police force that you call when you actually need help. So it's basically about how the state is this evil thing that should be mocked. Or, I mean, evil is too strong, but it's this ridiculous and kind of ha 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 kind of pseudo diabolical thing that is no use at all. And whenever you're actually in trouble, you're going to need to call something that's really like a combination of whatever Starlink, Tesla, SpaceX, and Palantir, all run by puppies, basically. So yeah, I'm sure, I don't know, I think somebody must have hit this years ago, because there are so many people who are prone to overanalyzing cultural objects, who are sitting in front of televisions with their children thinking, yeah, I mean, this really resonates with what I was studying in grad school. You really see how the capitalist system is justifying itself here.
My daughters are like, Mommy, can you stop? You ruin the movies for us. Because I will actually pause the movie and I will see what has happened here. You see what happened there? Why didn't that boy go for a girl that was just as attractive as he? Why does he have to go for the girl that you don't? Oh, boys, anything. Like, I'm bad. Like, I'm not even like, and it's a capitalist system. I'm like, and it's men. In my personal life, I'm like a rad femme with my kids. When it comes down to it, you know what you believe when you're teaching it to your children.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a kind of prison escape in Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. He helps foil a prison escape, I guess. That occurs. The Bresson film A Man Escaped is good. I think I might prefer Escape from Alcatraz. Anyway, we'll let our listeners escape from this podcast, and my co-hosts, who are, I think Jeff is tired of hearing about Paw Patrol. I could talk about children's shows all day with Ashley.
My brain was like, oh, and let me tell you about Snow White. I'm going to get to Snow White, right?
Yeah, I don't think we hit Snow White on the podcast, but I did really want to kind of dig in on that, talk about actual communist children's stories from the 1930s and what kind of true maximum wokeness would look like in children's entertainment. But
Oh yeah, that was one of those.
uh,
I paused the film to get. I'm like, look what happened here. She's got this whole village to help her, but no, she can't get help from anybody because that would be help from a man. No, she's got to do it all herself. Ladies, my kids are like, "Mommy, press play, please."
All right. Thanks, Jeff, Ashley. Thank you, listeners. CompactMag.com/subscribe.